All right, we're live now.
Thank you for joining us today. This is the second of 4 panels we are hosting on the circular economy, all of which are sponsored by Wheelbrator Technologies. Over the next 45 minutes, you can watch the panel live and send questions or comments using the live chat window on the WasteWise website, the WasteWise website, which is www.wastewise.be. You can also tweet your questions to BeWasteWise using the hashtag #TalkCircular. After this discussion, if you wish to know more about the other panels taking place later this month, please visit the calendar page on the WasteWise website. Now, the theme of our debate today is how can the circular economy be ignited into action? For this discussion, we are really looking at what levers and measures are needed to fast-track this agenda and to bring it alive. So ideas around radical change, incentives to encourage innovation, and early adoption models, what types of rapid response mechanisms are needed, and so on. I'm joined by 2 great panelists today, and I do encourage them to speak freely and be controversial at their pleasure. I'd like this to be a bit of a brainstorming exercise as well as an informative debate. So I will quickly introduce our panelists. First, we have James Greyson, a systems-led thinker who runs his own think tank, BlindSpot. James lives and breathes the circular economy, at least on Twitter, and I know he has some interesting views to share. We also have Geraldine Brennan, a researcher at a UK Centre for Innovative Manufacturing in Industrial Sustainability. Her research explores systems-based business model innovation, and her work has led her to team up with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Now, this debate does look to be quite a popular topic. We've already had questions submitted in advance, so I'd like to kick off with one of those first. It's a little bit of a philosophical one. The circular economy, it's aspirational, but at the end of the day, it is still geared towards consumption and keeping the industrial system alive and prosperous. So if we could ignite it into action so that it could reach that innermost circle whereby it's promoting the consumption of fewer but higher quality lasting items, could we still maintain growth from an industrial perspective? And I'd like to get James first to comment on this.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I guess the first thing to say about growth is that it's not a measure of industrial production or consumption. Growth is a purely financial measure. So if, for example, in a circular economy, you were to set up things so that as consumption, as physical resource consumption levels were falling, at the same time, there was an increase in economic activity. So in other words, the economic activity is actually partly used to decrease the resource impact and the resource flows. Then that would be one way to get economic growth. But of course, you don't have industrial growth then. You don't have a growth of physical resource flows. You have actually a shrinking of that. Does that help?
Yeah, that does help. It kind of leaves things in a little bit of a quandary. Geraldine, what's your take on this one?
I think it's a really pertinent question. What comes to mind is Tim Jackson's work on qualitative growth, which kind of links to what the point James is making. I read an old article coming from the 90s talking about the fact that if we're not careful, it was basically about industrial ecology, which is where circular economy ideas kind of come from, where the author Dara O'Rourke said, if we're not careful, we'll just end up with a cyclical throwaway society. So there's definitely this question of, it's very important to make sure we're being effective with the way we manage resources. However, pursuing circularity at all costs in all contexts is not necessarily always appropriate. So I think for me, it's about nuance when you think about how to apply these strategies and about businesses being critical about how they think about the strategies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think maybe that's the question that people will start to ask more as the thinking around this agenda starts to mature. So if we look at right now, obviously, there's a lot of traction building around the circular economy. You're seeing a lot of policy now starting to be shaped around it. I'd like to kind of just really put a spanner in the works. Policy at the moment seems to be a bit more about step change. Perhaps that's realistic. But if we were to stop all linear processes tomorrow, and then decide to build a circular economy, basically design it in from the start, how do we go about this? Or what do you think would be a useful starting point, I guess? James?
I guess I would reframe the question in the sense that if you really wanted to stop the linear economy tomorrow, then we probably have to take into account that the linear economy means people being able to transport themselves around and go to work, and at the end of the day to have a meal, because our food comes from these linear processes. So I wouldn't even ask the question about how to stop that, because most people are going to want to continue to do things in their lives and at the end of the day to eat. So probably I'd be more interested in how to make a super quick transition to a circular economy. And I don't think that's particularly difficult to do, but part of the problem is the way that we think about policy. We think that the smaller step changes, the incremental improvements are realistic, and that this is the way to do policy. When actually, if you want to make change on a big scale, which is what circular economy is all about, then what really matters is the kind of systemic policy. It's policy, but not as we know it.
So a bit of a Star Trek approach, do you think?
Exactly.
Geraldine, what's your view? I guess, I mean, what I'm trying to do there is force the issue and say, wow, if we really had to be radical and come up with a lever tomorrow, or a set of levers, you know, where would you go, I guess, on this?
That's an extremely difficult and horrible question. I kind of had a feeling it was coming, but I mean, I just to go back to your original question, then I will acknowledge the second question that you asked. I agree with James that this question of linear processes, we're not starting from scratch. Nowhere is starting from scratch. There is existing infrastructure. Most change is taken step by step, even though change, or rather the decisions you make to change, might give you a platform to do greater, more radical things. So I think it's important to remember that when we think about how do we create radical change. In terms of, you know, what's the magic lever, I don't know. I'm not a policy expert, to be honest. I think it's about thinking through perhaps what are the implications of these ideas for different sectors, and then looking at the implications across sectors. So if you think about WE legislation, it's done quite a lot for the electronics industry, and you know, it's not perfect, but at least it's enabled them to have a conversation about what they do with their waste. It's very different for different industries, so I don't know if we can design or kind of this one overarching grand plan to make everything circular without looking at the context of the industries that businesses are operating from.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll come back to whether policy intervention is the right lever, because some would argue that actually you need less regulation, and actually innovation, real innovation, is going to come from the grassroots movement, for instance, or it's going to come from business experimenting and that kind of thing. But if we do look at policy for a moment, you know, we look at this circular economy package that's come out of Europe recently. Now, a lot of people did welcome this, and it's a great package, but I think it's a great package if you want to kind of squeeze the best out of our existing linear economy. And you have higher recycling targets within there, which is laudable. You have landfill bans, that's encouraging. But even if you take maybe the next rung up from recycling, which is reuse, you have a combined recycling and reuse target there. Recycling applies to materials, reuse applies to products. So how can you really measure reuse? Is that a policy fail in itself? And I'll just be interested to get your views, Geraldine, on if you think that package goes far enough, should it have been a bit more ambitious? Should it have looked more at systemic change and how to link the circular economy with things like the sharing economy?
It's a good question around linking to other kind of policy frameworks. Like I said, policy is not my kind of turf in terms of research, so James might be better positioned to address the question, but I'll have a go. I think that recycling is important because, again, of the legacy of recycling. So increasing those targets and then trying to build on existing targets and looking at other dimensions is important. I went to, I can't remember the EU Commissioner's name who led the resource efficiency platform, but he spoke in London a few weeks ago, and he was very frank about the fact that he is bargaining with, you know, the DG for business and enterprise, and he's bargaining with all these different, you know, kind of directorates. So he's doing the best he can given the situation that he finds himself in. And he's also got companies who are signed up to things like the Circular Economy 100 who are paying lobbyists to lobby against aspects of policies that don't work for their industry. So it's just difficult. And it's important that we challenge these things, but I don't have the answer on that one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And as an interesting point you raised there, James, you know, politicians are obviously lent on from many different corners, many different lobbyists. You could argue there's a powerful recycling lobby out there, but there's not a powerful reuse lobby or remanufacturing lobby, for instance. Do politicians need to draw on more balanced dialogues, advisory dialogues? And if so, how can that, of a more honest dialogue where it's in everybody's interest to work together to build this momentum, how can that be fostered, do you think?
I think the way that you described it is perfect, to see circular economy as being a platform where everybody can come together and whatever particular interest that they have, you know, effectively whatever lobby area or sector they're from, that circular economy has really got something for them. And I think that it's the people, those of us who are very keen to see circular economy happen, there's always a natural tendency to start talking about waste and then start talking about recycling or reuse, you know, and what, you know, which of the waste solutions we think are the best ones to use. But if we actually want to make this thing happen, then we have to be careful of that kind of a trap of translating circular economy into a waste management question and then losing ourselves in the detail of that. Because then from a politician's point of view, that just sounds like a waste management lobby and different parts of the waste management sectors arguing against each other. So it's not, it loses the potential to be a vision for the economy. And I think that's the whole idea of the language of circular economy, and the reason why this is a more interesting language than what's been used in the past. The ideas, of course, go back to the 60s, you know, with various different kinds of terms. But the power and I think the relevance of circular economy is that what it should do is it reminds us all the time that we're talking about the whole economy here, and there's a choice about whether we run that economy in a way which can continue to succeed in the future, or whether we're actually, as you know, as economic players, whoever we are, whether we're all just sitting on a branch and cutting away at it, arguing with each other. You know, we need to stop cutting and get off the branch and look at this as a kind of a regenerative, positive model from whatever sector we're from.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, how do we bring a credible, perhaps, facilitator into the mix that can actually do this cross-industry, cross-policy dialogue? Who does this need to be driven by? At the moment, we see a lot happening in the business world, certainly, with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and their Circular Economy 100 platform. Geraldine, I'd be interested, because obviously you've had some involvement with that foundation. Have you had any access into that platform? And if so, do you think the type of collaboration that's happening is viable, I guess, or do you think there's still competitive concerns around perhaps intellectual property, competition laws, that kind of thing. Do you feel businesses are speaking freely enough in order to really drive transformational dialogue and change?
It's I did some work with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in 2012, kind of just as they were establishing the platform. I haven't been as involved with them as they've grown, which is kind of just par for the course, as they've looked at getting more senior researchers involved and more bigger players, which makes sense because I'm kind of, from an academic perspective, doing my PhD, so I'm still a whippersnapper. However, I think the interesting thing about the Circular 100 is that they realized, or what my observation of it was, that they realized that they needed a place where businesses could have conversations behind closed doors. And that's a conversation that's come up with my conversations with RAP around a similar time, where I was talking to them about, similarly these questions of dialogue and, thinking about where the power and the value chain is going to shift. If you go to a circular model, what have you got to win? What have you got to lose? Which ways could you experiment? And they were saying the same thing. Businesses have potentially a lot to win and in some situations a lot to lose. And while they figure that out, they're not necessarily comfortable talking about it in public. Once they've figured it out, then they're likely to share.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of communities of sharing.
Yeah. And it's interesting, do you think at the moment, obviously that platform is targeted at big business, and it's not what I would consider an inclusive debate yet. We don't have the SMEs in there, we don't really have the NGOs in there, we don't even have consumer groups in there. I mean, that just seems like a world away right now, getting consumer interest. So are we in danger of, we've already started with this, have we started from the wrong starting point, or do you just feel, well, actually we just need to start somewhere and then hopefully we can bring in these other stakeholder groups as time goes on?
I think we need to start somewhere, and ultimately big business has a lot of impact in supply chains. So organizations that start asking questions around transparency and material passports and all sorts do have influence. The World Economic Forum again is all the big players. So you're right, you do need to get smaller organizations and startups and other actors involved. I think it's just a case of, why aren't startups or creating their own kind of dialogue on this? Because there are loads of startups that are looking at these things. I think the conversation is happening in different forums in different ways, especially in London.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. And James, if we look at outside of regulation for a moment, I know you're a keen advocate of something called Precycling, which could be regulated or built in to the market in a way. But this idea of Precycling is around waste prevention, I believe. And do you feel that businesses need that kind of regulatory driver to actually scale up or fast track these processes, or do they just need to be left to get on with it? It's a difficult one because you need to be innovative, I believe, but at the same time you probably do need a stick or two.
Well, I wouldn't see Precycling at all as being a stick. And it's probably a bit more than waste prevention as well. So if you think about bringing circular economy into reality, then of course you're not talking about a vision anymore and a kind of future picture of what the whole economy is going to be like and what everyone's doing. What we're really talking about is what we should be doing now to make that future vision happen. So Precycling is really about translating it into practice. And so the definition of Precycling is what we can do now to make sure that today's resources, don't end up as wastes in ecosystems in the future. And so waste prevention, or what people call waste prevention or waste reduction or waste avoidance, that's part of it. That's one way to make sure that resources don't end up as waste. But of course, it includes the whole range of things that we talk about and reuse and setting up recycling schemes, and it's very action focused. So it's about what we can do now to set up all these kinds of different menu of possibilities, so that the resources and the products of today can remain as resources for either for the economy and people or for nature in future. And I don't think that there's any clash at all with innovation. What we're talking about when we're trying to make circular economy ignite into action, what we're talking about is the kinds of regulation that creates an enabling framework for innovation to happen everywhere, with every business and every household at every level. So it's not really about a contrast between top-down and bottom-up. What we're really talking about is setting up the whole system so that it works, so that the incentives are there to make the innovation happen in a way that effectively designs out waste. Because of course, people will innovate anyway. There's innovation happening all the time, and examples of circular economy happening all the time. What we're talking about is how to make those examples and that innovation work at a kind of whole economy scale, and fast enough so that it's really relevant to the problems we're trying to solve.
And I know, James, you have various discussions, don't you, I think, with kind of European policy makers and influencers, and kind of pushing this Precycling option. What kind of appetite is there at kind of European level, do you think, for something like this?
Well, there seems to be an interest in sort of creative and innovative approaches to circular economy as a whole system view. The European Commission, for example, invited me to present this approach at their Green Week, which is Europe's biggest environmental conference of the year. And just on Monday this week, I was invited by one of the EU member state foreign officers to come over to Brussels and present to all of the environment attaches from all of the member states. So there's definitely an interest there in systemic approaches. And if you look at the latest Commission communication, you can see right at the beginning that they're saying that circular economy is all about a full systemic change. And there's an interest in developing and supporting the kinds of innovations which will allow that kind of level of change to happen. And not just the kind of normal, traditional, incremental and sector-based approaches.
Yeah, and if we look at this whole idea around systemic change and system thinking, I mean, it's a great little snappy word, system thinking, snappy term, but what does it actually mean for most people out there? Obviously, everyone talks about, yes, there's a big urgent need for system thinkers. Well, number one, people don't really understand what a system thinker is, and so perhaps one of you would like to volunteer in a layperson's voice to just to define that, and then perhaps we can talk about where are these people likely to come from in terms of, there's a skills gap there. So how are we going to unearth these great system thinkers? Perhaps Geraldine, you'd like to have a stab at it.
I'll have a stab. It's funny because it's something that we do debate a lot in the Centre for Industrial Sustainability, because we're a group of engineers, management, organizational theorists, sociologists, economists, and from our different disciplines, we all have perspectives on what a system is and what systems thinking could be. And it ranges. I mean, going back to James mentioning, that the idea of a circular economy comes from traced back to the 1960s is to Kenneth Boulding, who is a key thinker in systems thinking. However, there are many other different flavors, and there's lots of different types of systems thinking. So to answer your second question first, I think that we have a pool of people. There's definitely academics who have worked in these areas for the last 60, 70 years and who have skills that need to be tapped into. Industrial ecologists are one of them. In terms of the question of what is a system, for me, it basically describes the fact that you have interconnecting parts and you have properties of that group of interconnecting parts that you can't reduce to the parts. So you basically have emergence of qualities that you can't kind of just say, okay, if I take this in isolation, I'll definitely get X. So essentially, you can't control for everything. And I think that makes policy making difficult, because even if we try and kind of look at systems interventions, we're not guaranteed that they'll play out the way we want, because they're dynamic. And I think on that note, I'll hand over to James.
James, yes. What's your stab at a system thinker, and where might we get these people from, apart from academia?
Well, I think that almost everybody is an intuitive, innate systems thinker, but it's just a capability which we often don't recognize in ourselves. And we often don't get the chance to practice that type of thinking because there aren't always the forums like this one today where we can talk about systems and thinking and what it means for circular economy. You know, these kinds of conversations just don't happen every day. And if you look at the policy world, typically, you know, governments and big businesses are doing everything but talking about systems thinking and systemic change. So I think that if there were these forums, then there was the support for this type of thinking and these type of development of systemic solutions, then of course the skills and the policy advances and innovations would happen very quickly. In terms of what it is, probably the simplest approach that I would suggest for people is to think about the way that we run a linear economy. And we don't need to tell anybody, please, will you make sure that your products are really badly designed and they'll fall to bits quite quickly. And then when they can't be used anymore, that they can't be then recycled or repaired properly. You know, those sorts of outcomes just happen naturally. And we end up with great big mountains of waste and you know, billowing emissions that end up as waste in the air, for example. So the system is, one way of thinking of the system is you know, what it is that's causing all of that. And it's not a particular kind of bottom-up or top-down thing. It's something that you find throughout the system. You know, it's the way that where we have a world view about how resources should be used or how the economy should be run. And it's the kind of incentives that are built into markets, like, for example, the way that traditionally you could get resources very cheaply and you could dispose of waste very cheaply. And you know, when there's a cost there, it's a cost that's paid by society or paid by the environment, and it's not built into product prices. So these are the kinds of systemic points where you can look for a change. And my great heroine for system thinking is Donella Meadows, because what she's saying about systems is that they are complex, but that doesn't mean that they can't be managed or changed. That systems will tend to self-organize and manage themselves, but they will be typically set up to create one kind of outcome or another. And at the moment, we've got the economy set up as a system which creates the outcome of a lot of waste at one end and a lot of depletion of resources and ecosystems at the other end. And what systems thinking is there for is to think, what are the levers and where are the points where we can create this kind of change, which will do what we're talking about today, which will ignite circular economy into action after having effectively talked about it and made efforts with it for you know, over 4 decades. You know, let's actually get on with it now.
Yeah, as well said, James. Well said. I'd like to, because obviously it's very encouraging what you say about each of us is a systems thinker in our own right. We wouldn't necessarily define ourselves as a systems thinker. So I'm wondering, I'll pass this one over to Geraldine. You say where people are defining themselves as systems thinkers are in academia. How do we get systems thinkers into business, for instance? Is this a case whereby a business might have to buy in skills or collaborate, or could they start recruiting for those types of people? And would they be known necessarily as systems thinkers? I'm wondering what you're thinking about that.
Just to rephrase it, systems thinkers are not only in academia. I was just trying to point to the fact that there is a wealth of knowledge and that there are people who've been thinking about these ideas, and they do exist. So it's about tapping into them and having translation, I think, actually, from some of the concepts to business or to strategists or to policymakers. And there's a very interesting LinkedIn group by a guy called Gene Bellinger, and it's called Systems World, I think. And he says, you know, if systems thinkers have been around for so long, why is it that no one understands us but ourselves? So I think James's point about the fact that, you know, systems thinking as a discipline is varied, flavored, and has complexity in it. How do we get people to engage the likes of Donella Meadows, leverage points, and things like that, and make it accessible? Because he's right, everyone has the capacity to think in systems. It's just, how do you manage the overwhelm when you deal with complexity? And it's about how do you park complexity without, or park it sometimes to access conversations. And getting, I think, comfortable with sometimes it's messy. So I think businesses do engage these ideas, and there's a lot of consultants and think tanks that are working in this space. So, for example, James's BlindSpot, Six Heads, Forum for the Future, there are organizations who are trying to make these ideas more accessible. And I mean, the likes of the reason the center I'm part of is set up is to translate to industry and make it easier.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting. I'd like to, because we've got about 15 minutes to go, so I'd just like to address the issue of the consumer, really. And the consumer does seem to be the one stakeholder group that is kind of left out of this circular economy debate most. Where it's an interesting one, because big companies are grappling with the idea of sustainable consumption and the kind of messaging that they need to promote this to their customers, especially business to consumer models. It's a tough nut to crack, but do you actually think that if we were to start building more circular economy business models tomorrow, bearing in mind we've got this interesting sharing economy starting to emerge, is sustainable consumption, I guess, it's already happening, or is it happening to a degree that could pull the circular economy along? Could the sharing economy and the circular economy start to merge? Is one dependent on the other? Where does the consumer sit in this? Are they a lever as such, or will they have to be kind of encouraged to kind of buy into this idea? James, what do you think about this?
I think the consumers are a key set of decision makers in the circular economy. Of course, they're the people who are going to be buying the products or the services of the future, which will be circular. And from the consumer's point of view, it's a fantastic opportunity. I mean, one of the examples that I gave to the EU attaches this week was some kettles which I've been buying over the past 3 years, because one particular brand of kettle, I ended up with 2 of them, and each of them stopped working, and the elements burnt out after around about a year each time. And so what ends up is that consumers like me are buying kettles that are very poorly designed and effectively designed to fail. And then after a much too short period, you end up having to buy another one. And that's a terrible nuisance. And this doesn't just happen with kettles. It happens to me all the time with a range of products, and it probably happens to everyone else as well. So one of the key things about circular economy, which people are just going to love, is that we're designing out the planned obsolescence, which you can see in all kinds of products where they have a potential to last for a really long time and be reliable and easily repaired, but actually they're effectively a kind of junk that only is really working and really attractive for consumers when they're new, and then quite quickly they end up as something that has to be replaced and paid for again. So it's resource inefficient doing it like that, and it's inefficient from the brand's point of view, of course, as well, because what they don't realize when they're making these kinds of poor quality products is that people like me just aren't going to go back to them. You know, I'm never going to go back and buy more products from that same brand which had the kettle that failed. And it's the same with every other badly produced product. So the businesses that will succeed, the ones that actually will be around in future, will be the ones who are designing with a circular economy mindset. And I don't have a particular view on whether that should be achieved with a sharing model or reuse or remanufacturing or a service system. I think that's something really to be worked out in the marketplace. It's a question for the producers and a question for the people who are going to spend the money to buy it. But whatever the model is, we should know that in a circular economy that those products are not going to end up as waste. And ideally, since energy and fuels are part of the circular economy as well, that we're looking out for how efficiently we're using the flows of materials so that, for example, something will last a long time rather than be built to be disposed of, even if it can be recycled. So that we're making sure that our fuel flows are minimized and also taking part in the circular economy.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
This issue of product durability is quite interesting because you're right, James, you know, most people do want products to be built to be designed longer, but then on the flip side there's a lot of people who just like upgrading all the time, and just like there is some psychological element of buying something new, and I think that goes quite deep in terms of how you relate to your own sort of self-esteem, how you relate to your own value system. And I know there's work being done to link up emotional design, if you like, into circular economy business model innovation. And Geraldine, I wonder if any of your research covers that aspect of things at all.
My research doesn't specifically, but I have come across emotional design, and I have come across the work done in Manchester by Tim Cooper talking about the role of consumption and identity. And I think businesses need to understand why we're consuming the products and what we're getting from consuming their products in order to understand what types of models that James mentioned, whether it be product service system or a longevity model, will work for that particular product line. I think the interesting thing is, and again, it's back to context. Where do behaviors exist that would facilitate product service system models? So something that's a pet subject coming from South Africa is that basically most people in the informal economy don't have access to credits and pay thousands of rand to get poor quality products with really high insurance premiums, over their hire purchase over 2 years. And I think that's a model where you have people already in a PSS model getting poor quality products, where it could take off. And it's about tapping into different contexts and understanding where people are ready want quality and are ready for it, but may be in a particular purchasing mode already.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this whole thing of why we consume and how we consume is pivotal, especially from a sustainable consumption perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, and I'd imagine as this debate goes on, we might see more kind of, not just product designers, we'll probably see more system designers, process designers, even communications designers coming into the mix. I know the Great Recovery work, which is being done by the RSA, is looking into that now. and behavioural anthropologists, behavioural experts, all of those people. And once they come into the mix, I think it'll be very, very interesting to disseminate some of that information. Right, we've got 5 minutes to go, so I'd just like to turn to some of the questions that are coming in. If anybody does want to ask a question, you've only got 5 minutes, so please either use the hashtag TalkCircular on Twitter or the chat window on this debate website. One is kind of touched a little bit on what we were talking about before. Institutionalized practices around a linear system, are they likely to be changed more by government intervention or more by grassroots innovation? If I can bring that one to James.
Sure. I mean, as a quick answer, if the government see their role as to set up the system change that's necessary for circular economy, and not to try to make the sort of innovative decisions for everybody on everyone's behalf, then there isn't really a conflict between the two. Government will set up the systems change, put in place the kind of market incentives that are required to effectively design out waste from product streams of all kinds and resource streams. And then you after that you see the bottom-up innovation happening as a natural expression of people's creativity and desire to make profit and do business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And Geraldine, have you any thoughts to add to that?
I think there's something to be said for how to make policy that allows for self-correction. So most policymakers want to have, an overall. They want to have a clear, easy, communicable position, as opposed to say we don't know about X, we don't know about Y, but we do know we want to go here, and in 5 years or 3 years we're going to review it. So trying to make more responsive policy making, so that you can create the system that is enabling for bottom-up innovation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how you do it, but
yeah. It's a tough one, isn't it?
No,
I've got an interesting question
it's not
here.
Tough.
Oh. It's not, well, this is what I love about James. there's no challenge that can't be surmounted. It's great. I love that attitude. It's very positive. I have another question here. We've only probably got time to answer this one before we say goodbye. But it's quite an interesting one. How do we maintain innovation in product design without encouraging high product disposal and churn out? And we're kind of seeing this a little bit happening in the 3D printing sector at the moment. James, could you just give me your thoughts on that one quickly?
Well, the innovation is really just a system behavior, and it's built into all of us to be creative and innovative and look for new possibilities which didn't exist before. So it's not really something that we need to tell people to do. I mean, for example, our last dishwasher that has failed had an innovation in the motor, whereby all the grease from the washing water would go into the bearings of the motor, so that after a certain number of years the motor bearing would just fail and fall apart. The previous belt that my son was wearing had an innovation which was a little groove around the axle of the buckle, where after the buckle was moved backward and forth enough times, the belt axle would fail and fall out and had to be replaced. So there is innovation out there and happening all the time, but in a circular economy, of course, you just get the wrong kind of innovation. And if you have, in a linear economy, you get the wrong kind of innovation. And if we were to set up, ignite a circular economy into action now, then the market incentives would be there so that the innovation that's happening anyway would be in the right direction. And, we would be making belts that last a long time and dishwasher motors that where the bearings don't fail, and everything else. The innovation would be a kind of system behavior that created the outcomes that we all need.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Geraldine, just to get your views on that, innovation versus creating more waste.
I think that it's definitely a paradox and a tension. So I disagree slightly in that the advance of composite materials is a challenge for circularity. And it's not to say we can't overcome it. There are paradoxes. I'd refer anyone to a really interesting TED Talk called Paper Beats Plastic. And it basically argues that there's no such thing as a sustainable material. It's got to do with the context that the material is used in and the behavior of humans when we use things. So there's no point having a belt that's going to last 30 years if after 5 years I decide I no longer like it. And it goes out of fashion and nobody likes it. So it ends up in landfill. Or, I mean, it could cascade into another source, but it's about context for me. But I agree with James that it doesn't mean we can't solve these problems. We just have to think about them critically.
Great. Well, hopefully this debate has given people some food for thought out there. I think it's been very interesting, and I'd like to thank you both for your thoughts. And to say to everybody out there, I hope you enjoyed it. You can tune in tomorrow. We have another circular debate going on. I think it's zero waste versus zero landfill. But do check on the BeWaste website, BeWaste website for that. So thank you, everybody, and good afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you, Maxine. Bye-bye.